That CPD show. My name is Chris Bright and I'll be your podcast host for today. And today I'm joined on the island by Danny Murphy. Danny, alongside his wife Naomi and their three sons, moved to lead Life Church in Bedworth in 2019. By God's grace, they've seen the church become a thriving, diverse and multi-generational church with a vast array of ministries, reaching many in the surrounding areas. Having previously ministered in Bolton and Fraserburgh, having served as youth pastor and associate pastor, Danny has experience of leading in various church roles and community contexts. Danny loves the local church passionately and believes in its God-given mandate to bring redemption and restoration to whole communities. He loves to encourage and equip those around him to rise up in faith and wholeheartedly pursue the call of God for their lives and ministry. Danny is a family man and also is a loyal Manchester United supporter. Also a curry connoisseur and infrequent gym attendee. So maybe we can get into some of that in a little bit. But Danny, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Good to be with you, Chris. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I don't know who wrote that, but that was very, very, very good.
I would say it was written by a genius.
Wow. The only thing that was a bit questionable is my loyalty to Manchester United. That is being tested to the limit at the moment.
Yes. I mean, we don't want these podcasts to date, but at the moment, at this moment in time, which is November 2023, it's not looking good at the moment, is it?
It isn't. But I'm hanging on in there. But good to be with you, Chris. Thank you for taking the time.
Brilliant. Well, it's great. Yeah, great to have you on the desert island, as I've coined it, because it is a desert island, not a desert island. I much prefer a desert island. I think it's a much better place, if I'm honest. So we're going to talk about desserts to begin with, but and after we've done that, we're going to talk about your three favorite resources. But shall we start by talking about your favorite dessert?
I think we should start there. Yes, I think we should start. Do you want me to just go in, reveal
go
that
for
immediately
it.
Off the bat?
What is your favorite dessert?
So, to be honest, I usually am a glutton for anything with chocolate in it. So, love a chocolate brownie, love a chocolate melt in the middle pudding, love a chocolate tart. But I imagine quite a few people at this point have probably listed chocolatey items within their
there have been
choice.
one or two, yeah. Although number one is the crumble at the moment.
No, I don't like hot fruit, so definitely I'll avoid that.
Okay, there we are. Okay.
Pineapples on pizzas and apples in crumble. No, none of that. So as I said, usually I love a chocolate-based pudding, but I've got to admit, I thought it'd be good to just plump for what I think is the unsung hero of the dessert world. It's very simple, but it's incredibly satisfying. And I would say that actually my favorite pudding above all others is rice pudding. Rice pudding.
Okay, rice pudding.
Preferably with a bit of jam on top, strawberry jam on top as well.
Okay, so I've not had rice pudding tons in my life. It's sad to say, really. But what do you love about rice pudding? What makes it so great?
There is just something incredibly comforting about that dessert. I think my love for it actually stems from primary school. I'm from Bolton in the north, and I think it is probably quite a northern pudding, in fairness, a northern dessert. And I went to a school called Plodder Lane Primary School in Farnworth in Bolton, where I'm from, which, as you can imagine, doesn't sound like the most inspiring of places, nor was it actually. It was pretty dark, pretty dingy, quite a depressing old Victorian school building, and I wasn't a huge lover of school, wasn't a huge fan of being there. The only rays of light for me in the school day was mid-morning milk. Do you remember that, when you used to get a bottle of milk at playtime? Were you young, old enough even to remember that?
Yeah, I do remember getting milk in the school time. Yeah.
Good. I don't think that happens anymore, but that was like something to look forward to in the school day. And then, of course, lunchtime to eat, but also hang out. But if on the lunch menu, rice pudding was in the offing, that was the best kind of school day for me. So hot rice pudding that would just warm the cockles on a dark, dingy winter's day in Bolton. Rice pudding, preferably with a bit of skin on top, as I said, and then some strawberry jam that you'd have on the top, and then take some time to stir it around, make it go all pink and tasty throughout. Oh, nothing like it.
Okay, and do you still make rice pudding today? Do you ever have it as a dessert, or do you just go for the ones, the pre-bought shop ones?
No, I don't make it. I can't claim to be much of a cook. But yeah, if I was actually in Madrid of all places recently with a few people, it was interesting. There were three of us, I think, from Bolton on the table, and all of us chose rice pudding or the Spanish equivalent of that, and it was a dream. It was delicious. So, like I said, probably quite a northern thing, but there's something comforting, and it evokes happy memories from childhood for me as well.
Oh, very good, very good. Yeah, I haven't had it. I haven't had it much, if I'm honest. Rice pudding. It's normally one of those ones where you see it on the option. It never inspires me. But I think if you've got that kind of childhood memory, it does make the difference, doesn't it? I think there's a lot of desserts that have those kind of childhood memories associated with them. I think so. Maybe I've got to give it. It's due. You know, give it a good go to give it a try.
You've got to give it a try. Rice pudding, change your life.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, rice pudding, that's what we brought to the dessert island today. Let's move on to your resources. You brought three with you today. Should we dive into the first one? What's your first resource?
Yeah, so the first resource I want to mention, and this is unashamedly an in-house AOG plug, I realise, but I want to mention the brilliant resource that is Young Lions. So I actually was part of the first cohort of young people that went through Young Lions. I think it was 2002, possibly 2003. So we're talking over 20 years ago now. But for me as a young leader, that was foundational and formative in my leadership development. So yeah, I thought Young Lions would be a good place for us to start this conversation.
Well, listeners of the podcast will may have heard that Stu Ellman also talked about Young Lions, and so I'd really like to hear from you. Yeah, what was formational about it? I've never been to Young Lions. I never had the opportunity to, but I'd love to hear. Yeah, what was it about it? Maybe there was something, particular sessions or things that really stood out to you. What was that thing that developed you in Young Lions?
Yeah. I mean, so for those who maybe don't know what it is, I guess Stu may have done a bit of an overview when he did the podcast, but in case there's anyone listening that hasn't heard that, it's basically a 3-year intensive leadership development and assessment bootcamp. That's the idea behind it. And it was launched by Pastor Simon Jarvis, who of course oversees leadership development now for AOG, but at the time was Youth Alive director. And basically the original premise was that each youth group in the country had the opportunity to send 2 young people who were displaying leadership potential. And what was amazing was that I had some youth pastors who actually saw some potential in me. So Paul and Zoe Reed, you might know those guys. They now are pastors up at Audacious Church in Manchester, part of the team up there. They were my youth pastors when I was growing up in Bolton, and thankfully they saw some potential in me when I didn't see much potential in myself. So even that journey was amazing for me in some regard. And then to land the weekend being totally out of your comfort zone, surrounded by people that you'd never met from all kinds of different places, was just a great, almost greenhouse of growth opportunities, how I described it. You were immersed for 2 or 3 days in just some brilliant leadership teaching. You were mentored and developed in a coaching group. You were put to the test practically, and that included physically. So some of the people who are familiar with Young Lions will know the outdoor sessions are particularly infamous. And in one of the years I was there, we had a major from the British Army, a guy called John Cole, who was like a special guest that Simon had wheeled in and put us through our paces. So it was just a brilliant, brilliant experience. But I think the key thing for me was at the end of it, your youth pastor got a written report, an assessment from your coach that weekend, and that really served as a discipleship tool for the remainder of the year. So it wasn't like you just went and had a great experience, but it was actually part of your growth track and development as a young leader. And I loved it. Yeah. And I think a big part of it for me was learning the importance of critique and correction, because a couple of my reports weren't all that impressive, to be honest. It wasn't like they were glowing reports. And I think sometimes we like to take encouragement, but actually some of the things that are most helpful for us are the critique and the correction, not criticism, but healthy and wholesome critique. And I would say that was really helpful for me at that stage in my journey, for sure.
Oh, brilliant. Do you remember any of the reports that you had? You know, is there anything specific that really sort of spurred you on or brought out something that maybe you had to think about Anything particular that comes to mind?
Yeah, I remember just in one of the reports, I always thought I did connect quite quickly and quite easily with people, but there was this description of me as being a little bit surly and standoffish. Now, again, you got to realize these people are taking a snapshot over a really short period of time. So thankfully, when you sit down with your own youth pastors, they're able to bring a bit of a wider and broader context to some of the critique that you might receive. But I remember it taught me the importance of first impressions, to actually just having a smile on your face when you don't feel like it even makes a great first impression. So a simple thing, but it was hugely helpful for me and still is helpful for me today. But yeah, I remember almost having a bit of a dagger to the heart moment when I thought, oh, golly, someone's receiving me in a way that I'm not intending to be received. But that in itself was a really valuable and important lesson for me for sure. But yeah, loved the whole weekend. And I think for me now, looking back, and again, it was quite a small group that journeyed through the first 3 years, probably a handful of us finished it. But looking back and seeing God use these ordinary young people in incredible ways still to get today. I remember Pete Wright was part of my group, leads a church called Springs in the Midlands now. Hannah Williamson, who now leads Young Lions, runs Young Lions, is a fantastic leader. So just seeing the ongoing fruit of that. And now as a church leader, but also as a father, my youngest lad, Jacob, he goes to Young Lions Juniors this coming weekend. My eldest boy, Jackson, is going to go to Young Lions for the first time with the youth next year. And to see it still having a generational impact, I think is an incredible testimony to the vision behind Young Lions, but also the ongoing benefit of it. So yeah, for youth leaders, youth pastors, church leaders actually might be listening to this, let's make the most of what's still an incredible resource. It changed my life and still is.
It's amazing to think, one event can have such an impact for so many leaders within Assemblies of God GB, and it's amazing to see the sort of the legacy that's come from that. A good question to think about for ministers listening to this is, how do you think that they could utilize Young Lions for their leaders, maybe, or what aspect could they put into practice? Do you think that of utilizing Young Lions? Maybe it's how could they look for the next up and coming leaders? Any advice that you've got on that about maybe spotting some of the leaders and maybe how Young Lions could help achieve that?
Yeah, I think again, spotting leaders is a responsibility we've all got. I think not always looking for the most obvious or the most likely. I don't think that was the case for me. And yet I had great leaders who were looking to call out and draw out things that I didn't easily identify myself. So making sure that we are holistic in our outlook of which young people we've got and who we can perhaps go looking for potential in rather than just seeing it, readily and available. I think trying to graft some of the content, perhaps, and some of the curriculum of Young Lions through youth ministry, discipleship programs, young leaders training through the year be hugely important as well. Like I said, for me, it wasn't just the experience of the weekend that made it so beneficial. It was the fact that that report and that assessment served as a discipleship tool throughout the rest of the year. And, having your own local leaders in your own local context, continually assessing and helping young people journey through things like communication and servanthood and living with integrity and being held to account for those things, I think is crucial. So whether youth pastors can start to graft some of the content into their thinking and programming for youth ministry, especially in leadership development, I think will just reinforce what a brilliant weekend kind of is the catalyst for in many young lives.
Yeah, great. And we also have Young Lions Academy now that also runs, which is what happens can happen in the church in between those. Young Lions happens every year, and but what happens in between those times? There's Young Lions Academy, which can help youth pastors, church leaders, just to think about development throughout the year as well. And that really has a compounding impact when those young people go to Young Lions every year. So just encourage all the ministers listening to this to check that out as well. Fantastic. All right, should we go on to your second resource? What's your second one that you brought?
Yes, so the second resource, this is a book, and it's a book called Visioneering by Andy Stanley. Have you heard of it?
Oh, well, I've definitely heard of Andy Stanley, and I've heard of the book, but I have not read the book. So I'm guessing it's about visions, but I'd love to hear a kind of a précis
Good
book.
guess, good guess. Yeah, so it's quite an old book actually. So it's not one of his more recent, not one of his more recent books, but I think it came out 99 actually, and I got it in the early 2000s. I think when I was on placement from Bible college in my home church at the time, and it's a brilliant, brilliant book, all about how to cultivate, how to create, and how to cast vision. And for me, it's been a book that I have referred back to time and time again on my leadership journey, I would say. The basic premise is it's not exactly a commentary of Nehemiah's journey in scripture, but it is a comprehensive unpacking of a lot of that journey in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And the principles and the practices that Andy extracts from that text, but also kind of couches it within his own journey, his own context of leadership as well, have really just helped shape the way I've tried to lead in various places and spaces over the years as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned about cultivating a vision or a culture of vision.
Yeah.
How does Andy how does Andy teach to do that? But how has that worked for you in your church? How do you cultivate that vision?
Yeah, I think the first lesson worth mentioning that he really unpacks well is the fact that anybody can carry vision, right? You don't have to be a spiritual superstar to be burdened with and have a vision and have a vision birthed through you. And Nehemiah's journey, as we all know, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a prophet, he wasn't a king, he didn't perform any miracles, no seas were parted or anything like that. He was a cupbearer. He had a pretty menial job. But God compelled and called this seemingly ordinary individual to carry an extraordinary vision. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, firstly, who don't feel that we are necessarily all that visionary. We might not feel like the next Steve Jobs or Walt Disney, Howard Schultz, Glenn Barrett even, dare I say. Those are outstanding visionaries who, are able to craft and create really compelling visions. We might not be able to be them, but we've always got to remember and recognize that God still wants to birth a vision in us and through us. So I think that's a learning point for me, taken from the book, but I've tried to apply in leadership as well. But I think a big lesson also is that it's a reminder to us that those we lead are also called to be vision carriers. Our job is not just to get them to carry our vision and serve our vision, but it's actually our job to help them discern and discover the vision that God maybe wants to have for their life and outwork in their life. Ministry isn't just reserved for the few who stand on platforms. It's often for those many that sit in our pews week in, week out, the seats of our congregation week in, week out, who I think we've got a responsibility to cultivate vision within. Ephesians 4:11 talks about ministry gifts to the church: apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, evangelists, etc. But the purpose behind those gifts being released into the local church is for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. It's about helping them to see the vision that God has got for their life, yes, to be outworked in the broader umbrella of his kingdom, but recognizing that anybody is capable of cultivating and carrying vision, I think is a huge lesson from that book that I've continued to try to outwork.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things I often think of is that vision can really be a team sport as well. I think for many church ministers, they can sometimes think, it's all on me, I've got to hear from God. But actually, like, God's speaking to your team, he's speaking to the people around you, and actually get a team together. You can cultivate that together, but hearing what God's saying, putting that into action, I think there's something to be said for that as well, for sure.
Absolutely. And Andy journeys through that again in the positioning of people. Our vision, sometimes we think of it as too individualistic, when it's a collective, how we shape that, how we create that, how we build towards that. You're absolutely right. It's about team. And I think, again, within that, don't disqualify anyone from playing a part in a vision, or perhaps being released to go and pursue a vision. I had a conversation with a lady in our church just a couple of months ago. She's 79 years old, and she came to me to present a comprehensive vision that I think, we just got to say, how can we get on board with this? How can we support you in this, and not decry it or ignore it because they're perhaps later in years, but say, hey, even in old age, if Caleb was taking mountains at 80 and Moses was still working things out when he was 120, let's not disqualify anyone from being able to play a part in the vision that God's out working in any context.
Yeah, fantastic. Another aspect you said talks about was the communicating of the vision. And I think that can often be quite daunting for ministers, because you feel like you've got to be, like you said, the Steve Jobs that's going to stand and do the big presentation. How do you communicate vision? What are some tips and tricks that you've learned along the way?
I think it's got to be communicated simply. So trying to condense it down to something that is memorable, understandable, clear, concise is crucial. So our vision statement here at Life Church is that we want to transform our towns, which is Bedworth and Nuneaton for us locally. We want to transform our towns, reach our region, and win our world. That vision is undergirded by Acts 1:8, where it says you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you to be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So it's that idea of local, regional, and even international impact. But again, taking time to cultivate that, excuse me, into a really concise and condensed strapline and statement that's memorable, hopefully. But then obviously you've got to put legs on making sure that you're working out that tangibly so that people can see the impact that you're having in your town. People can see that you're being a blessing to other local churches in the region. People can see that you're committed to mission to the ends of the earth, not just what God's doing in your immediate proximity. So I think it's got to be memorable, it's got to be tangible, and ultimately, you've got to personally embody it as well. So things, as the old adage goes, are not necessarily taught, they're caught. So whilst we've got to be creative in how we communicate vision, the best way of vision being received is when we embody it and we model that to the people that we're leading.
Yeah, I think it's Patrick Lencioni says that sometimes it's better just to get started with a less than perfect worded vision, but that you can get started with, because there's so many times I think you're trying to find the perfect vision and you're waiting and waiting and waiting, and actually let's get started with something. I often think that the best way to get sort of trust in your vision is to complete your last one, because actually that's what's going to give you when people see that's actually when a church announces a vision, we're serious about making that happen. So putting those things in place, those structures and goals in place to achieve it as well is really important.
Yeah. But as I said a minute ago, not waiting until it's perfect. And again, understand the journey's through some of this. Yes, it needs prayer, it needs planning, it needs process. But actually, it's just getting started. For us, again, locally, to give you a tangible example, a couple of years ago, we saw the increasing issue of food and fuel poverty in our town. And a commercial property came on the go in Bedworth Town Centre. We managed to get it for a decent price, and we've converted this 7,500 square foot space into a community grocery, coffee shop, a hub of support service, basically, for those who are bereaved. We've had refugees in. Our local MP now does his surgery there every month, and we see over 1,000 people coming through the doors, that many of whom wouldn't darken our doors on a Sunday morning yet, but it's their first access point into church community. And did we know what we were doing entirely as we started? No, we still don't, but it's giving it a go, getting it off the ground. And one of the things Andy Stanley talks about, actually, if you remember the journey of Nehemiah, it starts with identifying he's not in Jerusalem. He's in a citadel called Susa, but for some reason, Jerusalem is in him. He bears this burden for this place that's in ruin and disrepair. And I think sometimes we worry that if we're not in a certain circumstance or situation, we have no authority to envision for it. But the truth is, you might not be in food poverty, but the issue with food poverty can get in you. You might not be in addiction, but those who are grappling with addiction, that concern can start to develop within you. And I think, and again, Stanley talks about this moral imperative for a God-given vision. The way, in his words, you can tell that something's been conceived in the mind of God, not just in the idea of a man or a woman, is that there's a moral imperative for it. There's something that needs to be different. There's something wrong that needs to be made right. And having a look in our context, in our communities, in our towns, in our cities, thinking, okay, what do we not like? Because just even asking that question alone might be the catalyst for a God-ordained vision that he wants to outwork through you.
Fantastic, fantastic. So that's Visioneering by Andy Stanley. Should we go on to your final resource? What's your final one?
Yes, so last but not least, the final, and this is a book again, but the final resource that I want to touch on is called The Pastor by Eugene Peterson. I think we all know and love Eugene Peterson, famous for writing the biblical paraphrase, The Message. And this book really is like an autobiographical account of his journey and call to ministry, effectively. And again, just another book that when I read it, resonated hugely, I think, with the heart that God's given me for the ministry he's called me to. But just again, to hear some lessons, the good, the bad, and the ugly, from a hero and a legend of the faith, foundational, formative in my journey.
Yeah, I mean, I, like most people, have heard of Eugene Peterson, but I actually don't know a lot about him. So maybe it'd be really good to sort of unpack some of the things that you got from his life. I know he died a few years ago. But what were some of the kind of lessons that you learned from Eugene Peterson?
I think the biggest lesson from his life is consistency. Like, he was the most consistent individual. I think he pastored the same church in, I want to say Maryland. I think it was in Maryland in America for well over 30 years. And he describes one of the hallmarks of his ministry as being just perpetually present. It wasn't doing, the glamorous or the things that necessarily draw and attract attention. He was just remarkably consistent in serving and loving the people that God had positioned him to serve and love. And I think that is something that we can all learn from, and certainly was a hallmark of his life and his legacy. I remember he wrote another book called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, and again, I think that just unpacks some more of his principles of just being consistent, just being faithful, and trusting God to produce the fruit. I think sometimes we get it the other way around. We want to quickly produce fruit, but actually fruitfulness comes on the other side of faithfulness. And when we get to heaven, what will we hear? It's well done, good and faithful servant. Now, fruit is important, but the precursor for that is faithfulness. And I think that would be the biggest lesson that I would take from his life and his legacy. I think allied to that, remembering that ministry is all about people. Like, his long-term commitment wasn't to a platform or a project, it was to people. It was connecting with and caring for people. And most people won't remember the projects we were involved in necessarily, but they will remember the difference that we made to their lives. And I think, again, just a lesson from his life that I am trying to keep learning myself in amidst the busyness of life and ministry and all that entails. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that consistency is certainly something it's one of those underrated qualities, isn't it? We often think, like you said, about we want the fruit, and the fruit, of course, is important, but the fruit comes from, when you think of a tree, it comes consistently, and it's a tree is consistent in its seasons and its patterns, and fruit comes because of that consistency. It's not replanting itself, in a different place every year. It's consistent, and so I think there's something certainly to be found there. How has that looked like for you? Just how does it look practically day to day, just to be consistent? What are some things that maybe you do consistently that would help you in that role of being the pastor, like Eugene Peterson?
Keep showing up, Consistency is demonstrated by being perpetually present, as he speaks of. And I think being available and being accessible to the people that we lead demonstrates that consistency practically. When we look at the life and ministry of Jesus, he had time for people. He was compelled by mission and vision, and we've talked about the importance of vision already, but he went towards people. He was willing to be interrupted by people. He loved people. He celebrated people. He mourned with people. And I think just to continually have that posture where people aren't seen as an inconvenience, but they're actually seen as the prize. The prize of ministry is people being added to the kingdom, people growing and developing in their discipleship, their leadership, whatever you want to attach to that. And I think just living with that daily posture of, hey, I'm here for people. That doesn't mean we can be there for everyone all of the time, especially as the church grows. It's not healthy, and indeed it shouldn't be the desire that we're there for everyone. But we need to create environments where at least everyone has someone that's available to them and for them. And again, I never want to be too far removed from the cold face of that. And I think we were talking just before we recorded this, Chris, that for me, just a couple of weeks ago, I think we were scheduled to record this episode and I had to cancel because there was a pastoral crisis. 51-year-old man, took a bleed on the brain and collapsed and died from the impact. You can imagine the devastation that causes for a beautiful family, his wife and 4 kids. It was horrendous and it was horrific. But there was something precious, and there was an incredible privilege of being able to be with them, be with that family in the midst of that horror, and be with them in the hospital and just try and bring Jesus to them in the darkest season of their lives. And then literally within a couple of days of that, you're doing a wedding for a beautiful young couple, and you shift from, the valley to the mountaintop. And I think that's one of the privileges of ministry for me, that this is about people. They're not the inconvenience, they're not a nuisance, but they're the prize. And I think being there, again, not for everyone, but at least trying to be there for someone when they're going through grief or they're going through great triumph and success. Scripture says, doesn't it, about rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. You can't do that unless you're with them. If you're too far removed from the people, you can't savor the beauty of those moments. And actually, going back to the conversation on vision, I've found in our leadership that people are far more willing to follow your vision if they're familiar with your voice. And that comes through proximity, being with them, being accessible, being available. And I think just having that posture of consistently loving people and being there for people is crucial.
It's interesting because the 2 books that you've chosen, Visioneering and The Pastor, I think often as ministers it can be seen as 2 ends of a spectrum. You're either more visionary or you're more pastoral. Yeah. But I think what you're advocating for here is not a middle ground, but a both ground.
Absolutely, that both and, not either or. And I think we're getting that pendulum to swing healthily back towards where we don't see pastor as a dirty word or a secondary office within the body of Christ. And I always remember several years ago now, and again, I'm not going to name names, but I remember a quite significant leader of a sizable church in the UK. Fortunately, it wasn't AOG, but I remember being at an event at this church and hearing this renowned leader say from the platform, I don't want people to bring me their problems because I don't even like people, never mind love people. And when I heard that, it was just jarring, because if you don't like people, get another job. Do you know what I mean? Don't be in Christian ministry, because this is about serving God. It's about loving him, but it's about serving people and loving people as well. And I think we've got to make sure that even in our leadership, everything we do in terms of process, planning, policy, procedure, the prize, they're the vehicles towards us reaching and growing more people. It's not either or, it's both and, absolutely. And I think we're getting that balance back, which I think is healthy. But I remember, my title by design here at Life Church is lead pastor, which in essence is bringing those 2 worlds together. I recognize I've got a responsibility and a mandate to lead, but I'm also here to pastor and shepherd and care for people. And that requires sacrifices. The John 10 stuff, the good shepherd was willing to lay down his life for his sheep, and we are under shepherds under him. And I think we've got to be prepared to do the same.
Yeah, I wonder whether, the shift that the world's going into now, where most, the average age is now a millennial, moved from Gen X to a millennial now, and the Gen Z generation's coming through. And I wonder whether that's, like you said, that pendulum is needing to shift, because now if we're becoming, majority millennial Gen Z in our society now, actually that's going to need a different type of leadership. And I wonder, do you think that is going to be swinging back in the future more towards a sort of more pastoral, not away from, but adding back that aspect of pastoring back to the center again?
I think so because these emerging generations are more hardwired for community, aren't they? They are longing for community. Hence why that resonance with that personal touch, I think, will be received well by the generations that are coming through. I think we've just got to make sure, like perhaps the pendulum swung too much towards leadership, and there was almost a corporatization of Christian leadership in some circles, I would say. I think we've just got to be careful that it doesn't swing wholly towards just being pastoral, because equally there's a danger that the emerging generations don't like to be led. They don't like to be told things of absolute truth. Do you know what I mean? And have that conviction and even correction brought to their lives. So, like I said, it's not that one is better than the other. We need to bring both of those worlds together in synergy and harmony, because it shouldn't be either or. It's got to be both and.
Rather like the kind of the rice pudding and the jam coming together.
The rice pudding, what a perfect analogy to land with, eh? Putting the jam on the rice pudding and then blending it together seamlessly for a tasty treat. Love that.
Yes, exactly. Danny, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed it, and actually grappling with those aspects. I mean, I think Young Lions probably comes as the perfect counterpoint between those two things. Maybe not the counterpoint, but the thing that binds it together, because Young Lions is about developing the next leaders, but the next leaders have got to be serving that next generation. So yeah, thank you so much for that. So we've had Young Lions, Visioneering by Andy Stanley, and The Pastor by Eugene Peterson. Danny, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure I'll catch you again very soon.
Yeah, bless you, mate. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of That CPD Show. For more episodes, why not subscribe and give us a review? It really helps us out. See you next time.